So I'm going to say welcome everyone to the Tennessee Native Plant Society's Native Plant Seminar Series. And tonight's speaker is Sam King on removing invasive plants. Sam is currently president of the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council. Some of you have heard of it as TNPS. He's a stewardship ecologist with a division of natural areas in the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. That's still true, isn't it, Sam?
Yes, those are all true things.
Okay. His work involves a variety of natural resource management projects, including invasive plant management, native plant restoration, and rare species protection within the natural areas of Middle Tennessee. And he also works closely with Tennessee State Parks on resource management projects. So I'm going to say welcome, Sam. We're delighted to have you talk with us tonight. And if everybody would hold their questions to the end or write them in the chat box, which is down at the very bottom of your screen. It has a little caption that says chat. If you click on that, you have a place to write a question. Okay. All right, if everyone would mute themselves, I'd appreciate it. That way we don't have disturbing noises throughout the evening. And Sam, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Great. It's great to be here. I'll admit I'm a little nervous. Not only is this kind of like preaching to the choir, it's like preaching to the choir that may more than you about what you're preaching about. And so I can already tell by some of the discussion beforehand and some of the questions y'all are throwing out, this is going to be really good. And because of that, I'll try and stop well before the hour. The allotted hour is up, so we have some good time for questions and comments and some back and forth. I think that'll be really great on topics like this that involve management of plants or plant communities. There's always different ways to do things, and I always think it's useful to kind of hear ideas back and forth from everybody in the room. So I won't belabor that anymore, but it's good to be here, and we'll get started. Like Karen said, my name is Sam King. I am an ecologist with the Department of Environment and Conservation by day. And despite the very scientific and fancy sounding job title, what that boiled down to for the last 7 years is doing a lot of manual labor, trying to manage our state natural areas and the plant communities within those, particularly the sites that have rare and endangered native plants. That's kind of our mission, is to prevent extinction. And so in order for those plants to persist and hopefully thrive, we have to remove those plants that don't belong and may outcompete or otherwise adversely affect the native plants and native plant communities. So I'll go ahead and share screen. There we go. Are y'all seeing that?
Yes.
Do y'all have this little thing up at the top that's blocking part of the screen, or is that just on me?
That, I think, is just on you.
That's great news. So we'll get rolling. So I have here complex problem, period, simple solution, question mark. And what we're going to talk about is managing those native plant communities and removing non-native plants, and how that, like anything in ecology, can be a very complex proposition. Ecology is kind of it's an applied science in that there's lots of biology and botany and soil science and hydrology and stuff like that, and we kind of exist at that intersection, and trying to do what's best for the environment is often complex. And The solution on the surface is simple. We just remove the things we don't want in the system, and then the system will work. But like most things in life, it's a little more complicated than that. So what we'll cover in this talk, it's such a broad topic. So we're going to hit on kind of three things. First, we'll talk about invasive species broadly, kind of like that last question we had before we started. Like, is that invasive? Can I have it? Is it really that bad? I'm going to try and convince you. Next, we'll talk about a few specific species that are of particular interest to me in my job, and we'll talk about how we manage those different techniques we can use to remove those from, in my case, natural areas, but in the more broad sense, you can use these techniques in your yard, on your farm, at your friend's house. And I know many public land managers that would not turn you away if you wanted to work on those public lands. So we'll talk about that. And then lastly, I don't like to leave the puzzle unfinished. And so we'll talk a bit about what to do, after you undertake one of these large removal projects, and how you can ensure that you don't end up with another problem after you get rid of your first problem. So we'll dive right in. So why are we talking about this? I know this is the Native Plant Society, but who doesn't love wildlife? So let's hear what the wildlife folks have to say. Invasive species can change the food web in an ecosystem by destroying or replacing native food sources. The invasive species may provide little to no food value for wildlife. Invasive species can also alter the abundance or diversity of species that are important habitat for our native wildlife. And that's from the National Wildlife Federation. So they seem to be against invasive species. But it's 2023, and in a post-2020 world, we should do our own research, right? So here's just a sampling from the literature. Native flora diversity is significantly reduced underneath privet stands. So everybody should know privet. That's that big evergreen shrub we have all over the state. Lespedeza, a non-native clover in the legume family, can outcompete through shading native forbs and tall grass systems. So I'm sure y'all have heard presentations in the last few years. Our native grass systems are highly imperiled and a hot topic in conservation these days. And Lespedeza is one of the major threats to diversity in those systems. And some species like tree of heaven are allelopathic, which means they chemically outcompete other plants. They can emit chemicals from their roots or from the litter that falls from the trees that prevents germination or can prevent fine root growth or other things like that. So they're waging a chemical warfare against our native flora and allowing them to outcompete and thrive in their place. So hopefully that kind of gets you on board with what we're talking about. But you've heard me just in the last 2 minutes throw out several different terms. Exotic, invasive, is it non-native, is it a pest plant? And so what does exotic really mean? And that's what this slide is about. And this is one of my soapboxes that we have in the department. And so whenever I do these trainings for our employees, I believe words are important, and we want to, when communicating this topic, use the right words so that everyone's on the same page. So let's talk about exotic versus invasive. If something is exotic, it can, when you hear that word, it can mean many things. It can mean, I have down there at the bottom, it could mean pretty, like our native passion flower. That's a very exotic looking flower, the state wildflower. But in the context of ecology, in the context of plant community management, exotic is going to mean not native. It is a geographic descriptor. Something is either from here or it is not from here. And if it's not from here naturally, then it's exotic. But these other terms have important meanings too. Invasive, the name, the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council. That's very purposefully was changed from the Exotic Plant Council to the Invasive Plant Council because not all exotic plants are invasive. The picture on this slide is blackberry lily. It's a species of iris native to Asia. We find it in the wild here where it's been planted, but it reproduces here, but it does not spread. It does not take the niches of our native plants. This is a non-native plant that I've dug up in a natural area and put in my yard because it transplants easily. It's pretty. It's a very showy flower, and it doesn't do ecological damage. It's not really harming anything. So invasive is more of an ecological term. Something is either invasive or it's not. Another example we like to use is red maple, a native tree. It belongs in our flora. It has a place on our landscape. But in some unmanaged plant communities or ecosystems, it can spread, it can become unchecked, and it can choke out, especially in wetlands where it can tolerate those hydric soils and different hydroperiods and shade out our native wetland flora and be detrimental through evapotranspiration, altering hydroperiods, and becoming a real nuisance in our native wetlands. And so that's an example of one that it's geographically native. It is not an exotic plant, but it is invasive. Pest plant, another term you'll hear thrown around. This is not a geographic term. It's not an ecological term. It's strictly a legal term. So plants that are listed as pest plants are added to a list that's administered by the Department of Agriculture in our state and in many of the other states in the U.S. And those carry legal restrictions on the trade or sale of those plants. And those are oftentimes chosen, for various reasons. It could be arbitrary. It could be petitioned. It could be that it is commercially unimportant or economically damaging. There's several species on our list. Tennessee has a pretty short list of these, but that's a legal term. And then the last one on there I mentioned, exotic, sometimes means pretty, and that really doesn't have any place in this talk. Things are pretty or they're not pretty, and that's very subjective, and we're not going to use the word exotic to talk about that, because remember, exotic is a geographic term, and that's my soapbox on vocabulary. Hopefully you took something away from that. So now we'll dive right back into it. We've learned what it means to be exotic and invasive, and that combination of being non-native and ecologically disruptive. Once we've identified a plant that has those traits, what do? You'll start looking around your property. You'll see these, large privet shrubs, tree of heaven, growing along the interstates. Microstegia. This is an Asian annual grass, and it's a major problem in the Southeast. And your fun fact for this plant is ground zero, the introduction point for North America, is in our very own Knox County, is where it got its foothold in North America. And it was used as packing material for China being shipped, like China dishes being shipped from Asia. When the dishes arrived, they dumped the packing material out, and now we have Japanese stiltgrass or Microstegium verminium on the landscape. So you start to recognize a lot of these plants over time, and it can be overwhelming. What are we going to do? This last one is that Lespedeza clover that is a problem in our grasslands. So what do? We decide it's time for a restoration. We have this on the left-hand side, a understory and mid-story with very low diversity, shrubs and shrubs of privet. But let's say we want a nice post oak grassland here, high forb diversity, really nice open grown oak trees. How do we get from point A to point B? And I guess the low hanging fruit here is we got to get rid of those plants that don't belong. And there's several ways to do that, and we will very shortly talk about those. So privet, if you are not familiar, this is an evergreen shrub. It's probably one of the most common non-native plants in our state. East to west, you can find it in every county. It's dispersed not only by birds with those really nice purple fleshy fruits, but those fruits can float, and it's very common along waterways. In Middle Tennessee, if you've somehow made it this far and not seen privet or recognized privet, you can just go anywhere along the Duck River and see dense stands of it on the shores. It is common on the Duck and most rivers in our state. And it's not limited to rivers. It can grow uplands, bottomlands, slopes. It is not picky. It is unkind to our native flora, and there it is. So now we know privet. Another one I've mentioned, tree of heaven. This one, notoriously hard to kill. If it's a full-grown tree, you cut it down, then you've only made it mad. And vegetative clones and suckers can grow from those roots. In addition, it produces hundreds of thousands of seeds per plant, which are wind-borne. They have that wing structure like a maple and fly in the wind. Any major interstate in the southeast, and you'll see this plant growing along the roads. So that's tree of heaven. Both these species are woody, a shrub and a tree. And so we'll look at how to handle woody species. And any of these techniques, I've kind of zeroed in on privet and tree of heaven, but honeysuckle, mimosa, any of the woody plants that don't belong that you can find on TNPS's list, these techniques will work for any shrub or tree. And we're looking at, for this example, let's say our total height of the plant is greater than a meter, which is too tall to spray with herbicide. And our stem diameter is greater than 1 inch. So, a juvenile tree, a large shrub, something like that. Our most effective time to do treatments is in the summer and fall. Winter is okay. If you're hitting it in March or April, the sap flow on these plants is so vigorous. They are so adapted to growing quickly in this climate that anything you do is pretty much going to be overpowered by that plant sap flow. So we recommend against doing this work in the spring. And for small stuff, foliar herbicide application is the simplest method, but that's not always a viable option. But we'll circle back to that. So our preferred method of treatment for these, and again, I'm talking about woody plants greater than 1 inch in diameter, and generally more than just a single, if we're looking at a stand of these things, is the stump cut treatment. And that is, we cut it down, and you'll see we're applying a small dose of herbicide around the edges of that stem, and that's the active part of the stem, that cambium layer. Step one, you cut it down. This is an AmeriCorps team of 18 to 24-year-olds that came and worked with us for 8 weeks and did some restoration. This is a privet removal project. You can see that mid-story and understory was dense with those really thin, tall privet things. You can see the native trees kind of disappear into the background with all these other shrubs in the understory. So we cut that down, and then we need to treat that stem. Treat that stem with the herbicide. So you can do that in many different ways. A lot of the old school manuals tell you to paint it on. I prefer using these little spray bottles where instead of pumping it up where it'll really shoot out of there, you're gonna just give it a couple pumps and let it dribble out. Less is more for this. You just want to coat that outer ring and allow that herbicide to absorb. Another cool tool there on the far right, that is a dauber bottle, available on Amazon, very popular for arts and crafts, or if you don't like licking your envelopes, I think that's what it's made for, is moistening envelopes. But we fill that up with herbicide and can then kind of dab it without much waste or collateral damage around the outer ring of those stems. Oh, and you can ignore my little note at the bottom. That's left from a department training. CPO is our central procurement office. So if you buy things off contract, they come for you, and that's what that was. Here's a diagram. Y'all are probably all familiar with this, so I'll kind of gloss over it. But we're looking for that cambium layer. That's the active layer that's really going to take the herbicide down to the roots and get you a systematic kill on the whole plant. So let's say you go to pick out your herbicide and the guy at the co-op recommends 2,4-D. That will work. That will definitely kill the plants, but there's a few things to worry about. And I'm going to give a short explanation here, and I expect several questions because this is always a hot topic when it comes to herbicide use. 2,4-D is subject to flashback, which means that if you paint the outer edge of the stem that you cut down, and just picture that stump on the left-hand side is still a full-grown tree, and it's a native tree. It's one we want to keep. So we cut down our tree on the right, we paint the outer ring of herbicide. What some of these chemicals can do is travel down through the roots, and then where roots touch underground, they form this really cool network. And sometimes within species, it can even, lead to carbon sharing and resource allocation between different individual trees. But when it comes to poison, you don't necessarily want the sharing of resources. But where roots do touch, they can form grafts underground, and you can get flashback where that herbicide travels to a neighboring plant. There's my little flash for flashback, and sometimes can even kill the plant that you want to keep. So just something to be aware of. I don't say that to scare you from using any chemical or using this treatment method, because it is very effective, especially with Tree of Heaven, which is notoriously hard to kill and get rid of. But it's something to kind of research and look into. It's a good treatment in non-sensitive areas. This is a chemical that we don't use in natural areas, but is very, very prevalent in the agricultural world and easily available. And so I just put this little PSA out there as something to be aware of. Now, another option for herbicide application is stem injection. And we've transitioned to this, especially in wetlands, where we need to remove Tree of Heaven or even red maple or some of our other native trees that can alter wetland hydrology. And this is a veterinary syringe. So it's made to apply medicine to animals. But the University of Florida had done a lot of trials with this like pretty cheap and readily available equipment. And they can, with a drill, pop little holes through the bark into the cambium, and then give micro doses of undiluted herbicide. And you end up using a much smaller volume of herbicide, and you have virtually no waste, where with the stump cut treatment and foliar application and a lot of your traditional herbicide applications, you see that little dribble or drip down the side of the stem. That's herbicide that's doing you no good. With these metered dose syringes, every time you pull the trigger, it's putting one milliliter of fluid into the hole that you drilled. And so you are only putting in herbicide that is right where it needs to be. We tested this application method after Florida used it on some different species, in mangrove swamps. So not necessarily apples to apples. So we wanted to test it out. And at Prentice Cooper State Forest near Chattanooga, we did some sweet gum and red maple treatments in an area that has white fringeless orchid, a native, one of our 50 native orchids that is federally threatened. So it's on the endangered species list at the federal level, a very important plant. And it was getting shaded out. And we tried this treatment and it worked great. We had no issues with flashback. We had almost 100% kill rate of the plants that we were trying to get rid of and almost no collateral damage. So I threw this slide in because this is a new-ish application method, and we're really pleased with it. So there's that. We were talking before we started about weed wrenches, and so most of the application methods that I've talked about have involved herbicide, and that's not because I'm on the payroll of any herbicide company. Quite the opposite. But when you work at the scale that we tend to work, of hundreds of acres, it's really the best way to make progress. On smaller parcels or like your personal property, there are lots of other options. There's just the old-fashioned cutting it down. That's always great. And then there's these leverage tools. Weed wrench is kind of like Kleenex in that it's a brand name. There's several different brands that make this. Weed wrench was the original, went out of business, came back. The whole story there. But these are great tools, and we use these leverage tools, especially when we have volunteer work days. We have 3 or 4 of them, and you can turn volunteers loose to pull up plants. It's great. A quick pro-con list. If you're cutting a plant and treating the stump, or not treating the stump, if you're just cutting it down, you have very little, if any, soil disturbance. So if you're on a steep slope, or if you're in an area prone to erosion, then that might be a better bet, because when you pull these bad boys out of the ground, you're trying to get as much of the root as possible, and they can leave a divot, and you can get you can have some issues on steep slopes. But we still use these, and it's a great tool. That's really all I can say about it, because it's a very simple tool. You're grabbing plants one at a time and pulling them out of the ground. And there's that. So when we do department trainings and talk about different methods, we always have our people think about, is this a project for cutting, or is this a project for pulling? Quick word about Lespedeza. We talked about it in grasslands. Can produce up to 300 million seeds per acre. Very common. The best way to treat Lespedeza is a foliar application of herbicide. And believe me, we have looked for a better way. But this is the most efficient and best. And as a forb, cutting individual plants is not great. The literature shows that mowing it down just makes it angry, and it produces a lot of seeds from a really short plant. So this one pretty much requires chemical care. Not all herbicide applications are created equal. You'll see here in the picture, are we spraying from a boom? Are we doing targeted backpack application? Herbicide conjures up lots of visions of, just nuking fields and leaving behind moonscapes and the scorched earth and all the other, cliches. And that can be true. But in an ecological context, we think about low pressure and low volume. Those are kind of our 2 rules. We want to use as little herbicide as possible to get the job done. And part of that is using the backpack sprayers, using the hand sprayers. It's still tedious work. There is no silver bullet with herbicide. And we advocate that, poison is poison, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. And as long as you're following all the label instructions and using all your protective equipment, it can still be a fairly safe and effective tool for vegetation management. For Lespedeza and even privet or some of these other plants, before they get to be a meter tall, we use a broadleaf specific herbicide in the triclopyr family, and have really good luck. It doesn't give you the moonscape because it doesn't kill the native grasses left behind, and so you don't end up with these big brown spots. You end up with, you know, healthy grasses with the dead plants that you're trying to kill. The surfactant that we use reduces the volume of the chemical needed. That's just it's basically Dawn dish soap without the smell or the color. It's a water soluble surfactant that allows those water droplets to break surface tension, and one droplet covers a much larger surface area than it would otherwise, because we only need to coat the plant. Anything that drips off the plant is waste, just like with the stump cut treatment. We don't want to just be dropping herbicide into the environment if we can help it. We want to use very targeted applications. And here's a good case study of a time where we kind of practiced what I'm preaching. Hopefully some of y'all are familiar with Dahlia foliosa. That's the leafy prairie clover, a cedar glade endemic here in Middle Tennessee, federally endangered. Big deal. This is a major focus of our department, is trying to stabilize some of these populations, get it to spread, reproduce successfully. But it's a grassland plant, and we've already mentioned that Lespedeza is a major grassland problem. So how do you deal with a federally endangered plant and a noxious weed, invasive, exotic? It checks all the boxes that we need to get rid of it from a natural community. But the kicker is they're in the same family. They're both Fabiaceae legumes. So any herbicide that will kill one will kill the other. And we don't want to kill the prairie clover. In fact, we can't afford really to lose any. So here is a small scale herbicide application. It's called Green Shoots. It's a foaming applicator, and it allows us to stick the herbicide individually onto the stems that we want to kill. You can see this picture. The blue is the foam herbicide. It eliminates any drip. It eliminates any drift where, you know, a sprayer, those droplets can be blown by the wind and hit non-target plants. And this takes all that out of the equation. It is very tedious, and so we only use it in these most sensitive sites. But outside of our department, I know that Southeastern Grasslands Institute has implemented this type of herbicide application in a couple of their restoration projects at a more broad scale. So this is a really cool thing. You can see within those red circles is the federally endangered plant. The Lespedeza here has got the blue herbicide on it. And then we came back later and have really good results with this. We've been able to really turn a couple of sites that were in bad shape because we didn't know what to do, and really turn those around. And they now have healthy and expanding leafy prairie clover populations. Another control option to reduce the amount of herbicide needed. Mowing or mastication, which is just like mulching of woody material. Instead of stump cut treatment, which is tedious, instead of broadcast foliar spraying herbicide, which can put a lot of herbicide onto a site, instead of doing those, you can kind of whack down, mow, mulch up the undesired plants. And then, like, you will likely still need chemical control to take care of that population, but you will use much less chemical by only treating the things that resprout. Rather than trying to treat a mature plant, you tackle the little babies that come and take its place. And so that's been an effective method for us. And that speaks a little to a philosophical debate we have is, are we doing control or are we doing eradication? Do we truly think we can remove something from a site completely? And with the plants that I've mentioned today, the answer is probably not. And so we just try and keep those invasive plants in a place where they are not adversely affecting the native plant community. If we catch a new invader early enough, it's possible to eradicate. But in today's growing world, with animal vectors moving seeds around, with international trade and travel at a scale that's unprecedented, it's virtually impossible to keep a site free from non-native plants. And so there's a lot of monitoring, watching, treating things as they pop up, trying to keep these things from having, detrimental effects to our sites. And that's kind of where I come down on it. But that's, up for debate. A lot of people are purists and their goal is 100% removal and eradication, and it's a noble goal. But you can go crazy or burn yourself out. And then if you're burned out, you're not doing any good. So we look at control. Can we get to a point that our native plants are happy and healthy? And that concludes the invasive plant removal and treatment portion of the evening. But I feel like I'd be doing a little bit of a disservice coming to the Native Plant Society and only talking about non-native plants. So the privet's gone. What's next? This is a picture from a privet and young cedar invasion in an old field. And it had gotten to a point where prescribed fire was not a useful tool. It had gotten to a point where understory diversity was almost gone. And so we came in and removed that understory and midstory. And that looks pretty heavy-handed. And I would agree, this is very heavy-handed, but we'll circle back to this site in a little bit and see how it turned out. This is a Latin idiom, or vacui, or nature abhors a vacuum. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. The woods were dark and foreboding, and Alice sensed the sinister eyes were watching her every step. Worst of all, she knew that nature abhorred a vacuum. And it's true. Nature does. Like, if you've cleared a spot for your garden, if you've tried to remove vegetation anywhere, short of nuclear fallout or some of the nastiest herbicides you can find, stuff's going to come in. You're not going to have bare dirt for long. So how do we make sure what comes back is what we want to come back, and not, some of our colonizing species that are often non-native and invasive? Don't kid yourself. You've removed the privet, but the exotics are still there. The aforementioned Lespedeza has a seed bank life of more than 15 years. So even if you removed it all, came back the next year, sprayed it all, killed it all again, you would have to do that for 15 years without allowing any new seeds brought to the site before you could really say that you had something eradicated. Privet's a little better. It only lasts 3 years, but birds are carrying it from miles away. Tree of Heaven seeds can last up to 6 years. So the job is not done. Also, what's next door? Birds, other animals. This is Nandina, a toxic, non-native, invasive species that escapes from cultivation at people's houses, and we find it in natural areas all over the state now. It's been a major problem. Cedar waxwings love those bright red berries, and it kills them dead. We have, potential invaders all over. Bradford pear is a big one. If you drive by old fields in the spring, you see those bright white trees. The calorie pear, or the escaped Bradford. Miscanthus is a big one that's happening now in East Tennessee. This showy grass, it's really cool. I'll give it that. It's a very cool plant, but it produces hundreds of thousands of seeds. You see those big floofy seed heads, and they spread very easily. If you drive to Asheville on the I-40 or I-26 corridor, you see this in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. Starting, we're kind of at the beginning stages of what's probably going to be a statewide issue before too long. And so, how do we keep things out? And before we decide what to do, we have to know what the goal is of the property that we're talking about. Is it your backyard? Is it a state park? Is it a wilderness area? Are you looking to increase, aesthetic or recreational values? Are you trying to provide habitat for pollinators? Are you perhaps at a site with a rare or endangered plant that needs protection or habitat improvements? And how do we get to that goal? Once you've decided what that goal is, that helps you narrow in on what species you're doing, what type of restoration you're going to undertake. And then, are you going to be active about it, or are you going to be passive about it? And these are both valid options. Passive restoration is typically what we do in the natural areas program, and that's necessitated because of the scale. Active restoration is very expensive. If you're buying seeds, or even more expensive, buying plugs or containerized seedlings. The advantage is, though, it is a much faster way to get from point A to point B. You get to choose your species. Passive restoration takes time. Luckily, government employees get paid by the hour, and so we have no problem waiting to see what passive restoration brings us. And we're always looking for, that triple intersection of good, fast, and cheap. And I'm here to tell you that X does not exist. And so a lot of times when you're planning the restoration of a site where you've removed invasive plants, you decide which of these is most important to you, and focus on that. And the other two, you may have to make some compromises. That said, if you come up with something that is good and cheap and easy, please shoot me an email and let me know what that is. I'm always willing to try new things, but I haven't found that X yet. Ask yourself, what's the budget for the project? How much time do we have? Is this your backyard, where you've got all the time in the world, and you're kind of tinkering to see what you can come up with? Look at your adjacent properties. What are your problems going to be? If you land on passive restoration and you've got that miscanthus, silvergrass next door on either side, you're going to have to be very vigilant and make sure that as things start germinating, catch them early and remove the undesirable species. And you don't have to choose one or the other. You can mix it up. You can do passive restoration, but you are passionate about Blazing Star. By all means, add more Blazing Star to your passive restoration. The other picture here is an interesting case study where you can see there's ag field, but they've left strips of kind of remnant prairie in the ag field to promote pollinators. So they're growing and harvesting on either side of this strip of prairie, but leaving that strip of native vegetation as refugia for wildlife. I always mention fire when I talk. Sometimes it's a stretch to fit it in there, but it's a passion of mine. We have a very active prescribed fire program, and as part of restoration, it is very relevant. Almost all of our state has been or should be touched by fire. The communities we have, the open herbaceous communities, even a lot of our woodlands benefit from fire. We see decline in oak recruitment. We see decline in shortleaf pine because of fire suppression or exclusion. And so, if you're in a suburb in Davidson County, this is probably not the right tool for your project. But if you're working on larger tracks, something to keep in mind that fire can often be a very helpful tool. The U.S. Forest Service maintains a database that will tell you, you search for species, native or non-native, and it'll tell you whether fire will, help it or hurt it, is the simplified version. But it can tell you, hey, if you have a Johnson grass problem and you treat it with herbicide and then come through with a fire, you've probably taken care of that. Or you have a problem in your native prairie restoration. You're going to want to take care of that before you try and implement a fire, because fire will make Lespedeza spread. And so there's great information out there on that. And so that was my footnote about fire. This is that site. So this is at Vesta State Natural Area, and we burned, came back the next spring, and we have a lot of this rose vervain. Awesome to see. And you can see the fire scars on those trees in the foreground and midground, where the bark has been burned off. But we got a really great response at these sites. So we come in, we do a heavy-handed removal of our exotic species, and we are conflicted because we're running heavy equipment over a natural area or a project area or your backyard or farm. And it's going to look ugly, and it's going to hurt, and you're, wreaking havoc. But just a couple years later, with patience, and this is a passive restoration, but this is that site. Amazing flush of goldenrod, really cool sumac, that red plant in a native grassland with post oak scattered around. This is a great site for wildlife, great site for forb diversity at different times of the year. So it's always nice to see an encouraging image, right? When you're about to take on a project, begin with the end in mind, and know that, it's all for that end product. And lastly, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't plug the Tennessee State Parks license plate. If you don't already have this, and you don't already support another specialty license plate, if you're rocking the solid blue, let people know that you support native plants. This, Tennessee State Park license plate, the money from your renewal fee comes to the department and goes into a fund that does not revert back to the general fund. It stays with our department and can only be used on native plant habitat projects. That could be native landscaping projects at our park facilities. It can be invasive plant removal in our park lands. It can be native plantings like pollinator meadows, hemlock planting where we've had adelgid issues, and other great habitat enhancements in our state parks. So that is officially the end of the PowerPoint, and I think I've left enough time that we can hopefully get a little bit of discussion.
All right. Wow. Thank you, Sam. Lots and lots of questions. Very specific.
Oh man.
Does glyphosate cause flashback?
It can. And it's not a simple yes or no. They've observed flashback in glyphosate on certain things. So orchids have been a little susceptible to flashback. But not broadly. So we use glyphosate for a lot of our stump treatments, except where we have orchids. And then we've used that stem injection method with a triclopyr chemical to mitigate any chance of that happening where we have a rare plant that may be sensitive. So yes and no.
I've heard that that cut stump for tree of heaven is not recommended because cutting it will stimulate root sprouts, including far away from the tree you cut. So it is better to basal bark them. Are you cut stump treating them without root sprouts?
Yes. So it's never a one and done with tree of heaven in my experience. So one of the things we've done is do a cut stump treatment that will typically kill the tree within a certain diameter or a certain radius of the stump. And then we monitor for those root sprouts and try and catch, when they're 6 to 8 inches tall, come and zap them with just a regular foliar herbicide. And that kind of gives you an idea how far out the roots go. On our native trees, it's pretty easy to guess how far that root spread is. It can be about 1.5 times the width of the crown. So you go out to the edge of the crown and then go a little further, and you kind of know where that is. Tree of heaven can be all over the place. And so, especially on times where that distance is much further than any tree has the right to be, doing the cut stump, accepting that you're going to get some root suckers and watching for them and staying on top of them. And that's been pretty effective. When we're in a grove, we do a basal bark. We also do a hybrid hack and squirt and basal bark, because the basal bark sometimes isn't as effective. And so we'll put a few hacks and use a basal mix that gets that basal oil on the trunk. It also gets that chemical directly into the cambium. And we've had really good luck with that treatment method.
What is the most effective way to remove creeping Charlie from my yard?
Ooh, that's one that we don't deal a lot with in natural areas. I have it in my yard, and I don't have a good answer. I've mowed it as short as it'll go. It kind of comes back. I imagine that an herbicide would take care of it. That's not something that I do in my backyard. Just with kids and dogs and stuff running around. I'll do it in the front where we don't have people rolling around in the grass, but I figure I get enough exposure to herbicide at work that I kind of keep the backyard as my herbicide free zone.
On the stem injection method, how many holes do you drill?
So Florida did an interesting study on this. So about 1 hole per 2-liter bottle cap of stem. They're like SOPs for this were written for contractors. And so, imagine a 2-liter Coke. If you took the cap of that'd be 1 hole. If the stem was roughly 3 caps wide, then you'd put 3 holes in it. And if it was as big as the 2-liter Coke, you're shooting for 8 holes. And and you go up from there. So if it's 2-liter Coke bottles wide, you'd do, 12 to 16 holes. That is pseudoscientific, but that's how they measured it. And we had good luck with that method.
Sounds like it. What would be the best time to seed a grassland? And can native seeds be sown in the winter?
I defer to other people's work on that one. So both Roundstone and Prairie Moon and some of the other native grassland seed vendors have really good step-by-step guides on how to do that. And that's what we use when we've done plantings at state parks or some state natural areas. We manufacturer recommended, that's what we do, is what they have researched to be most successful, which I don't know off the top of my head. I think you can sow them in the winter, but they have kind of a step-by-step guide that's very, very helpful.
Sounds good. After spraying, when new plants appear, how do I know what Lespedeza babies versus desirable plants look like?
So I got good news and bad news. They are kind of hard to tell apart when they are very small.
Mhm.
But the good news is that's not a very effective time to be treating them. On Lespedeza, especially Lespedeza cuneata, which is the photos I was showing, and that's the most common in our grasslands. There's different Lespedezas in different parts of the state, but for this one in particular, herbicide is most effective once it starts its branched phase. So August, once they are at a very recognizable height at that point, when it's the most effective time to treat them. And believe it or not, you'll use less herbicide than treating them in June or July when they're, single stems, because you have to kind of hit that whole stem. When it's in its branched phase, you hit that middle third of the plant where all the branches come together, and it's toast. And so it's a pretty easy way to identify and treat it in the late summer, early fall.
What is the best way to dispose of invasive plants, especially in the urban areas?
So a lot of the plants that we'd be trying to get rid of in urban areas, honeysuckle, privet, a lot of the shrubs that I have and see around my neighborhood, aren't going to resprout the way that a kudzu or some of these others really nasty ones, like where if you threw a scrap in your backyard, you'd have a problem next week. Most of our urban and suburban problems don't do that. And so you can add them to your compost. You can, mulch them up with your lawnmower. You can put them in the trash. I don't usually recommend that just because it increases, landfill mass. At our house, we kind of, the shrubs we put in a pile in the back corner, and when it's time to have a little campfire and roast hot dogs, we burn them. So it's dispose of how you would dispose of any other yard waste, unless you have kudzu, and then we need to have a separate talk, because it's a bear.
Which herbicide and concentration for cut stump treatment of tree of heaven?
We've done, I think label recommendation for glyphosate, and we use Rodeo, the trade name Rodeo. It's the one that's, I don't want to say aquatic safe, because that makes it sound like it's not a problem. If it got dumped in the water, it definitely would be. But we use Rodeo, and the label recommendation is, I think, 50% dilution, which we follow pretty closely. With Tree of Heaven, we have bumped that up, to a little bit of a hotter mix, up to 75%, just because that tree is so hard to deal with. That gives it a little extra oomph. We've also used a triclopyr, both Garlon 3A and Garlon 4U, at kind of the same rate. 50% is recommended, and we've bumped it up a little higher for Tree of Heaven.
Okay. I want to remove Johnson grass in a fescue field. If outrider herbicide is not suitable, what is?
You said outrider herbicide?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that one. I'll tell you how we treat Johnson grass, because it has a tendency to be glyphosate resistant, just because of all the Roundup Ready genes that are floating out there in the agricultural world. We see Johnson grass get sprayed with a heavy dose of Roundup and not die. And so we tend to mix glyphosate at a lower concentration with an imazapic plateau herbicide at 1%, and have really good luck. It is a little soil active, which for Johnson grass is good, because as a perennial grass, it has a robust root system, and so that soil active herbicide has really helped us nip some problem areas in the bud.
Okay. if not 2,4-D on Tree of
I
Heaven particularly, that grows in my flower garden, then what should we use?
think Nick Douglas asked the same question, so I made notes. Sam, is that Garlon, Garlon?
Yes.
3A,
Yes.
and then Garlon 4U.
Yes. And those are both like for home use, that may not be the most practical option. Those are sold, in 2.5 gallon concentrate jugs, and that would last in your yard
A lifetime.
forever.
So rodeo would be the way to go.
That's kind of the same story. What you can do, and what I do at home, I don't buy the stuff I use at work for my house. But the active ingredient is available in some readily available herbicides. So if you go to Home Depot, or you go to Lowe's or Ace or anything like that, you're looking for the active ingredient triclopyr. That's TRICLOPYR, and it's often branded as like brush killer, or something like that, like tough begone, or I've seen it with a bunch of different names, but they all have a ingredients list on the front of the bottle. And if you're looking for triclopyr, those are the products that I would use for Tree of Heaven, especially for people that don't want to use glyphosate, which is understandable. It's a good broadleaf specific. It won't by itself, it won't kill grass. A lot of times it is mixed with something in those ready to use products that would kill grass. But if you find one that's only triclopyr, then that's going to be safe to use around grasses, and it won't leave big brown spots the way Roundup would.
And Steve Ford said something about, I don't know how to say it, Amherst honeysuckle. I've got 2 of those and I've left them in my garden, but are they going to take over and kill all my flowers?
That's an interesting one. Like it's a really bad plant in Middle Tennessee, especially in Nashville. You see like the hedges along almost any road, and that's what it is.
Okay.
And so while it may not take over your flower bed, like a maintained flower bed, it will produce seeds that birds will take all over your neighborhood. And it is a problem plant.
Okay. And you said something about red maples. I thought they were pretty, so I've been transplanting them into an area. Should I?
That is fine. Red maple is a great tree. I just use that as an example in a very specific instance where we have a native tree in a certain ecosystem that is displacing some other native plants. So just an example of how a native plant can be invasive. We had them growing up. They're not a problem, especially in yards, where you're not worried about your wetland hydro period. They're great. So sorry if that caused any confusion.
All right. Lots of thank yous here. Thank you for a very good presentation. Thank you for the response, and thanks so much for this presentation. Enjoyed it and took notes. Thank you. Good talk. Thanks for the information. Enjoyed the presentation. Okay. Does anyone else have any more questions? If so, unmute yourself and ask away. Anyone else?
Can we join you in like volunteering to remove invasives and plant natives in any of your projects?
Yes. So I am bouncing around all the time. Your best option is to reach out to whatever your closest state park is, and they tend to organize things. March weed wrangles are really big. I think all of the state parks host a weed wrangle, and then usually another work day in June that's focused on invasive plants. And and a lot of those have a planting component. If you're in South Nashville, the last couple of years we've done projects at the Ellington Agricultural Center, which is state land. It's kind of like a park, except we have big state offices all over the place, and it's one of the places where I work out of, and that's typically where I am on those weed wrangle days. And we've done several honeysuckle removals, for 2 or 3 hours, and then because forestry's office is also on campus, they provide bare root seedlings, and we've done a lot of planting there in that first week of March. That's always a fun event. If you're looking for other volunteer opportunities, you can reach out and email me, and I can try and get you in touch with your closest state park or state park friends group or some other volunteer effort. Unfortunately, these days I'm in a lot more meetings and coordinating things than actually getting out and doing the work.
Can I jump in real fast? It's Leslie.
Sure, go for it, Leslie.
I was going to say the weed wrangle is really awesome and all those other opportunities, but also there's National Public Lands Day on September 23rd.
Yes.
And so, like in our federal lands, I know that like my local park is doing an invasive plant removal all day long, and they're asking for like 300 volunteers.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I looked at the sign up. I was like 300. And I'm on vacation, of course. But yeah, so check out maybe some federal lands around you as well, and see what's going on, and just Google National Public Lands Day, September 23rd this year.
All right.
Sam, I noticed that you had a full field of goldenrod and sumac after clearing it and letting it so I've been pulling up goldenrod thinking it was a problem, but I can't tell it from the cosmos and the marigold. Should I just leave it and let it bloom in my marigold and cosmos garden?
If you want goldenrod in there, I would leave it. If you don't want goldenrod, I would pull it out. It's
okay.
It's not hurting anything unless it's hurting you. And so, that's the really cool thing about gardening and incorporating native plants into your landscape is they're just there, and if you don't want them there, you can get rid of them, and if you want them there, you do nothing and they come back. So it's really cool. There's a telephone pole in my backyard, and I hate weed eating around it, so I quit, and it just popped up in goldenrod. So now we have goldenrod around the telephone pole, and that's great.
Cool. Thanks.
Couple comments. Says to Bill Billick says to volunteer in the Memphis area, contact Overton Park Conservancy. Randall Graham says Imes in Knoxville and Reflection Riding in Chattanooga often sponsor invasive plant removals on a regular basis. So there are some good suggestions of places to volunteer. Any more questions? I'm going to remind you that this has been recorded and it will be posted in a few days on the TNPS website. So if you want to go back and check some information, especially about some of these chemicals, you're more than welcome to do so, because you'll be able to run through the recording. You can fast forward through some parts and pause and listen carefully in others if you didn't quite get all the notes that you wanted. Okay. Any more questions? Last call.
And if you think of something, I'm pretty easy to find. I've got about the easiest state email. It's just sam.king@tn.gov. No middle initial, no numbers. It's great. Or if you want something a little flashier, you can do the invasives at tnipsey.org, and that will also find its way to me. So,
okay. All right. Well, I'm going to say goodnight to everyone after saying, first of all, thank you, really, Sam. That was fabulous. Lots of good information. We have people from all across the state that are listening in, and we appreciate your guidance. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks for-
Sam. It was wonderful.
Oh, thank y'all. This was a lot of fun. Hope everybody has a great night.
All right. Good night.
Good night.